You've seen their pages, or rather, the absence of them. No recent pictures, no tagged nights out, no holiday reels stitched together for strangers. Sometimes just an old profile photo from a better phone. Maybe a single quote left years ago that still collects the occasional like dust on glass. While everyone else is building small digital museums of the self, they leave theirs empty. Silent spaces that seem almost prehistoric in a world trained to overshare. At first glance, it looks like indifference. They just don't care about social media. But that explanation collapses the moment you notice how deliberate that quietness feels. The stillness has weight. It's not laziness, it's architecture. A choice to step back from the endless cycle of projection, curation, and performance that psychologists now describe as the attention economy of self-presentation. For most people, posting is a way of keeping their identity in circulation, a continual process of social verification. Every photo says, "I'm still here, and here's the version of me that fits today." But for the ones who stop posting, that loop begins to feel claustrophobic. The self becomes a brand to maintain, and every update feels less like communication and more like inventory control. Their silence, then, is not withdrawal, it's reclamation. Researchers in digital psychology have found that non-posters, sometimes called passive users or lurkers, often experience social media as cognitively exhausting rather than stimulating. A 2016 study from the University of Sheffield showed that individuals who primarily consume content without contributing report lower stress and higher perceived autonomy than active sharers. It's not that they fear exposure, they simply feel more authentic in restraint. The psychological mechanism here is what self-determination theory calls the need for autonomy, the freedom to choose when and how to reveal oneself. So, they choose silence. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they've recognized that every post is a negotiation between truth and optics, between privacy and performance. Silence paradoxically feels more honest. In their quiet profiles, they reclaim the right to exist unrecorded. There's also a subtle layer of emotional self-protection. Studies on impression management fatigue suggest that constant self-presentation triggers chronic, low-grade anxiety, the feeling of being permanently watched. For some, the simplest antidote is digital disappearance. To step out of the algorithmic spotlight and breathe. To let life happen without a lens waiting to document it. And yet, their absence doesn't go unnoticed. In a culture that equates visibility with relevance, their silence unsettles others. We call it mysterious, detached, or even antisocial, because we've forgotten how to interpret privacy as health. The quiet profile becomes a Rorschach test. People project their own discomfort onto it. They must be hiding something. They're depressed. They're above it all. But most of the time, they're just tired of being decoded. So they watch, they scroll, they remain present but unseen, ghosts in the data stream. Their choice isn't about rejection, it's about calibration. They still crave connection, but on their terms, not the platform's. They have simply realized something the rest of us keep forgetting, that attention is not the same as intimacy, and visibility is not the same as existence. In the end, not posting isn't absence, it's authorship. It's the quiet rewriting of a social contract, a declaration that being can exist without broadcasting. And in the noise of the digital age, that silence speaks volumes. When someone stops posting, the world rushes to explain it. Silence online is so rare that it instantly demands a story. We assume distance, arrogance, depression, secrecy, anything that fills the gap left by their absence. In a culture that reads activity as aliveness, not posting looks like a warning sign. It's fascinating how quickly we pathologize restraint. Social cognition research shows that the human brain is allergic to ambiguity. We are meaning-making machines. When we can't read a signal, we invent one. The sociologist Irving Goffman called this the presentation of self. Every act of expression builds a frame through which others interpret us. But when the frame goes missing, people grow uneasy. Because your silence removes their ability to predict you. Colleagues whisper, "They're probably hiding something." Friends joke, they think they're too good for social media. Even strangers feel entitled to translate your stillness into a flaw. It's a classic case of what psychologists call attribution bias, the habit of explaining other people's behavior through internal traits instead of context. We see their quiet feed and decide it must reflect detachment, when in fact it might reflect saturation, boundaries, or simple peace. There's also an evolutionary layer to this discomfort. Visibility has long signaled trust. In small group societies, those who shared openly were easier to read and therefore safer to interact with. Digital life has twisted that instinct into a belief that transparency equals virtue. Platforms reinforce it. Algorithms prioritize the active, reward frequency, and quietly demote the silent. So when someone opts out, our conditioned brain labels them as non-participants in the tribe. Studies in online communication back this up. A 2021 paper from the University of Vienna found that non-posters are often judged as less friendly, less competent, and even less emotionally stable by active users, despite no behavioral evidence to support those judgments. In other words, silence online triggers the same social suspicion that used to follow the person who left the campfire early. And there's irony in this. The same culture that tells us to be authentic also punishes people who express that authenticity through privacy. We celebrate self-care, but only if it's posted. We call withdrawal healthy, but only when it's photographed against a sunset. A digital detox doesn't count unless it's announced. This creates a strange inversion. Privacy begins to look like a provocation. The quiet user becomes the mirror no one asked for. Their absence reflects our own dependency back at us, and we interpret that reflection as judgment. It's easier to call them aloof than to admit we envy their detachment. In the end, most of what people assume about the non-posters says more about our collective addiction to visibility than about their personal motives. The silence of others exposes how deeply we've fused attention with worth. When someone refuses to play, it breaks the spell, and we scramble to explain the glitch. So we invent myths. They're lonely, they're arrogant, they're hiding. But maybe they're simply free. The impulse to stay silent online rarely begins online. It starts much earlier, in those first small lessons about attention, exposure, and what it costs to be seen. Developmental psychology shows that our sense of privacy forms in childhood through feedback loops of observation and control. Some children grow up in environments where every move is commented on. Parents posting pictures before they can speak, teachers grading their behavior publicly, peers measuring value through visibility. From the first day, the message is clear. You exist only when others approve of your performance. Over time, that message turns corrosive. What once felt like validation begins to feel like surveillance. When these children become adults, social media doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like déjà vu, the same watchful eyes, the same pressure to curate. A 2020 study in the Journal of Adolescent Research found that individuals who reported high parental monitoring through digital sharing as teenagers were significantly more likely in adulthood to describe social media as emotionally intrusive. Their withdrawal later in life isn't apathy, it's an instinctive correction. Cognitive behavioral research adds another layer. People who experience chronic evaluation anxiety, the subtle dread of being constantly assessed, often develop avoidance strategies that mimic introversion but are actually self-defense. Avoiding online exposure protects the same psychological boundary that overposting erodes. This mechanism is not about fear of judgment per se, it's about exhaustion from managing too much of it. There's also the emotional echo of self-determination. Psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan wrote that autonomy isn't just the freedom to act, but the right not to act when an action feels coerced. In digital life, the coercion is invisible, an algorithm whispering that silence equals irrelevance, that absence erases you. People who resist that whisper are often those who've already learned what dependence on approval can do. Their quietness is not rebellion, it's recovery of agency. And somewhere beneath all that theory lies something more human: fatigue. After years of converting experiences into shareable fragments, many reach a point where their memories start to feel outsourced.
Every sunset recalls the urge to photograph it, every emotion an impulse to phrase it. Psychologists call this externalized memory formation, a subtle cognitive drift where living and documenting begin to fuse. Choosing not to post becomes a way of separating the two again, of remembering what unrecorded life feels like. Sociocultural studies support this too. In interviews conducted by Shoshana Zuboff's research group on the age of surveillance capitalism, long-term non-posters described their silence as a way of staying human in a system that constantly converts the self into data. That line captures the heart of it. Silence isn't an absence of communication, it's communication with oneself. So the roots of digital quietness reach deep, into early experiences of exposure, into the body's memory of being watched, into the weary recognition that selfhood shouldn't require an audience. What looks like detachment is often a mature reconciliation between connection and containment. They've learned that protecting one's inner world isn't isolation, it's maintenance. And in that stillness, something quietly profound happens. Life starts belonging to them again.
Modern psychology doesn't treat silence online as an absence of personality. It sees it as an adaptive regulation strategy. In other words, when the digital noise becomes overwhelming, stepping back isn't apathy. It's self-preservation, disguised as restraint. A growing field known as digital well-being research examines exactly this pattern. In 2018, Andrew Shabilsky and Netta Weinstein from Oxford University showed that people who deliberately limit self-presentation online report higher subjective autonomy and lower stress than those who post frequently. The explanation is simple but profound. Every post invites micro-judgments. The more you publish, the more you outsource self-esteem to an audience you can't control. Choosing silence reclaims that power of evaluation. Neuroscience supports this too. Functional MRI studies on social reward systems reveal that feedback loops triggered by likes and comments stimulate the same dopaminergic pathways that respond to monetary gain. The brain begins to treat attention as currency. But as with any currency, the market inflates. Each hit of validation buys a little less calm. For many people, withdrawing from social posting breaks that addictive circuit and restores what psychologists call baseline affect stability, the way to feel content without constant digital applause. Then there's the concept of context collapse, introduced by Dana Boyd in 2011. It describes what happens when all the audiences of your life, colleagues, friends, family, strangers, merge into one blurred crowd online. The self that performs for all simultaneously eventually fractures. People who stop posting are often those who have felt that fracture most sharply. Their retreat is not withdrawal, but repair, an attempt to re-separate their identities after years of compression into one endless feed. Research on digital minimalism extends this idea, showing that intentional non-sharing correlates with higher measures of focus and emotional clarity. Participants who practiced online silence for even short periods reported an increase in perceived agency, that subtle sense of living on their own timeline instead of the platform's. In plain terms, when they stopped performing life, they started living it again. There's also evidence from the study of social surveillance anxiety, the chronic awareness that one is being watched. The more users feel observed, the more self-conscious their behavior becomes, often leading to cognitive fatigue, irritability, and emotional blunting. For these people, non-posting is an act of nervous system hygiene. It reduces hypervigilance. Silence, in this sense, functions like rest after overstimulation, not isolation, but recovery. Finally, cultural psychologists point out that online silence can serve as boundary management. We evolved for small circles of trust, not the infinite gaze of anonymous observers. Maintaining privacy online satisfies what self-determination theory calls the need for competence and control over one's environment. It allows identity to exist without continuous external validation. A 2022 Pew Research Center survey found that 64% of adults who post rarely describe their choice not as detachment, but as a way to keep parts of my life real. So, what looks like absence is actually regulation, an effort to preserve the stability that constant performance erodes. The science keeps circling back to the same conclusion.
People who post less aren't rejecting connection, they're redefining it. They've realized that presence and publication aren't the same thing, and that sometimes the most radical form of self-expression is to say nothing at all. For a while, digital silence feels like healing. The moment you stop translating your life into content, something inside you unclenches. The day slows down. The mind stops counting moments by notifications. There's a strange, almost physical relief in knowing that nothing you do will have to be performed later. No captions to craft, no version of yourself to edit. Just presence. Unrecorded, unrated, unquantified. Psychologists call this phase autonomous regulation rebound, when a system long controlled by external rewards starts self-correcting through withdrawal. You feel clean again. Decision fatigue drops. You start noticing texture, light, smells, the things the screen flattened for years. Cognitive scientist Gloria Mark found in her 2019 study on attention that even short periods of disconnection restore executive function and reduce cortisol spikes. That's why the first weeks of silence often feel like a spiritual detox. Your nervous system finally drops out of broadcast mode. It works psychologically too. Without the constant mirror of public opinion, the self begins to stabilize. You no longer shape experiences for a reaction. You simply absorb them. Identity stops being something to market and becomes something to inhabit. Researchers in media psychology call this re-internalization of identity, the gradual return of self-definition to private space after prolonged public exposure. It's why non-posters often describe their days as quieter but fuller. But like any protective mechanism, it has a threshold, a point where retreat stops being medicine and starts becoming avoidance. When silence stretches too long, it can harden into distance. The walls that keep judgment out also keep intimacy out. Social psychologists refer to this as the avoidance spiral. The more you control exposure, the more you fear it. Eventually, even safe forms of sharing, conversation, vulnerability, simple openness, start to feel like threats to stability. It's a delicate balance. Digital silence gives you back agency, but agency without contact turns sterile. Human beings regulate emotion cooperatively. We borrow calm from each other. Remove those mirrors entirely, and the mind starts to echo. Anthropologist Sherry Turkle noted this paradox in her book, Reclaiming Conversation. Solitude nurtures self-awareness only when it exists alongside connection. Silence as a choice is freedom. Silence as a habit can become a cage. So yes, it works. It heals the burn of overexposure, resets attention, rebuilds inner authority. But it also carries a cost that arrives quietly. One day you realize that while you were guarding your privacy, you also guarded yourself from being known. People stopped asking because you stopped letting them in. The feed no longer owns you, but neither does anyone else. And that's where the loop reverses. You retreated to protect your sense of self, only to find that the self needs witnesses too. Even silence wants to be heard. At first, silence feels like freedom. Then it starts to taste like absence. Weeks pass without updates. Messages slow, then stop. People forget to tag you because they stop remembering you, in the digital sense of the word. The algorithm, indifferent and obedient, begins to erase you from other people's feeds, like a machine quietly rewriting history. And that's when the strange loneliness appears. Not the kind that comes from being unseen, but from realizing how visibility has become part of our collective heartbeat. The psychology of withdrawal describes this as social attenuation, when reduced contact leads to a gradual weakening of perceived belonging. We are social organisms wired for reciprocity. Even the smallest signal, a comment, an emoji, a shared link, keeps the web of connection alive. When you disappear, that web slackens, not because others stop caring, but because the system that once carried you out to them no longer remembers your shape. In studies of digital abstinence, researchers like Hunt and Alcott found that people who quit social media report both lower stress and lower social satisfaction. The nervous system recovers, but the social circuits start to rust. You feel calmer, yes, but also less anchored. The same silence that steadied your thoughts now begins to thin your world. There's also an identity cost. Our digital selves may be curated and artificial, but they're still extensions of the narrative we tell about who we are. Stop updating it long enough, and you begin to feel like a story left unfinished. Friends move on, contexts shift, and suddenly you're the ghost at your own timeline. Not forgotten, just unread. Still, this isn't a tragedy, it's a calibration problem. Silence isn't meant to be permanent, it's meant to remind you that you can choose when to speak. The healthiest kind of digital quiet isn't withdrawal from the world, it's the ability to return on your own terms. Because total disappearance costs something precious. Feedback. Not the shallow applause of metrics, but the subtle reflection that reminds you where you end and others begin. Psychologists call it co-regulation, the way humans maintain emotional equilibrium through shared attention. Without it, self-awareness can start looping inward until it becomes self-absorption. And yet, there's beauty in what this silence teaches. You learn that your value isn't measured by updates. You learn that meaning doesn't require an audience. And you learn, perhaps painfully, that being seen and being known are not the same thing. So the cost of not posting isn't invisibility, it's solitude. But solitude, unlike isolation, still has a door. You can walk back through it anytime, carrying with you something most people in the digital storm never find: the quiet knowledge that you exist, even when no one is watching. The point of silence was never to vanish. It was to remember that you were whole long before you were visible.